If everyone could take their seats, please. The chair would like to call to order tonight's CUSD 201 regular meeting of the Board of Education on January 7th, 2020. And we'll go around the room, please, with roll call.
Mr. Armstrong.
Here.
Mrs. Charlton.
Here.
Mrs. Coyle.
Here.
Mr. Price.
Here.
Mr. Rudy. Mrs. Strohmeyer.
Here.
Ms. Wilson.
Here.
Thank you.
If we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First, I'd like to say Happy New Year to fellow board members and community. It's 2020. Okay, the first item on the agenda is approval of minutes. Are there any questions or comments? The chair will enter a motion to approve the minutes of the December 10th, 2019 regular meeting of the Board of Education as presented.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the closed session of the December 10th, 2019 regular meeting of the Board of Education as presented.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. Okay, are there any public comments?
Hi, I'm Dana Hayjack. I'm a Manning parent. I just wanted to come up here and take a minute to thank the board for hearing the parents' public comments at the previous meeting and then moving to put our concerns on the agenda. We see that and we appreciate that, and I just wanted to come up here and publicly thank you for doing that, because I know it's kind of a thankless job at times, and I want to make sure that you guys know that we are grateful that you're making these steps and you're continuing the discussion. And as you can see, there's a lot of parents here that, and we're all glad that this is a continuous conversation. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other public comments? Okay, consent agenda then. The chair will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented. Number 1, personnel recommendations. 2, approval of board travel expenses. And 3, approval of additional December 2019 expenditure report.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mrs. Strohmeyer.
Yes.
Ms. Wilson.
Yes.
Mr. Armstrong.
Yes.
Mrs. Coyle.
Yes.
Mr. Price.
Yes.
Mrs. Charlton.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first item under discussion is the class size discussion. So following on what Dana said, so what happened, we're going to do just a little background of where we are. So obviously we've heard from the community and we've also received a couple emails. And so I asked the board president and the superintendent meet and talk about the agenda and what we're going to put on it. So I asked Kevin if he could start to do a preliminary dive into, research and documents for the board to look at so we can revisit this conversation. So to give a little history lesson, especially since we have some newer board members and members of the community. Back in 2011, Joel, 10 or 11, we started looking at the class sizes that we had, and they were very uneven. We had some classes that had 30 and 31, and then there were some that had 11, 12, or 13. And so these were across vertical grades. So these were the same children that were moving up in different buildings in that. So we started to look at the issue of class size. And we talked about it for quite a while. And we needed to, before we could talk about how to deal with the numbers, we had to look at a number of things. One thing we needed to do was we needed to make sure we had the physical space to do something about that. So, and at the time, the district office was at Manning. and it took up a good deal of space at the district office, at Manning. Also, so when we took South School and made that half of the district office and half of the preschool program. We also worked on the second floor to deal with like the 4th and 5th grade classrooms to make, if some, I don't know if people know, but there were a couple of rooms that were huge and then some that were smaller. So we talked about, in terms of physical space, making it all more even. So what we did then was there was a strong understanding on the part of everybody that we needed to do something because the size of the class mattered. We talked, we looked at a number of different studies. We talked to parents, we talked to teachers, and the board discussed it at length. And as Kevin very adequate, I don't want to use the word adequately, but he always talks about every decision we make has to be student-centered, and it always has to include the financial avenue. So when we're looking at a piece like this, we're looking at every single one of those features. So in 2012, we did look at the class size, and we came up with guidelines. And this document has been something that we refer to a lot. And one of the things that we talked about, and we definitely talked about, instead of making it a policy, making it a guidelines, because what we're dealing with are children, and we have to always leave room for variations. So this 2012 memo that Kevin gave to the board talks about what is, we are committed to the best learning environment for our students. And one factor that can influence the educational experience is the teacher-to-student ratio. So it was very important to acknowledge that that was a strong need at the time, and still is. So what it also says is the following guidelines will assist in staffing discussions in the future, and the guidelines are dependent on available classroom space and the fiscal needs of the district. So what happens every year is Kevin does a whole budget process with the administrators, and they look at all avenues of it. But every spring, we look at the enrollment. What does the next year look like? And that determines a lot of factors. So these were the guidelines that we came up with, and they are posted in board docs for anyone. So what we do, let's take kindergarten. It's 20. The recommended class size is 20. And then if it goes over 23, we have a discussion about whether we're going to split those classes. So, for instance, a couple years ago, we had a kindergarten class that had 50 students. And we discussed, well, are we going to just do 2 classes of 25? And we said, no, that falls outside the boundary of 23. So instead, we talked and wanted to add a third kindergarten class. So then that made classes of 16. And that has, or 17, that certainly has happened through the years and that. Because we as a board and administrators don't want to push that outside number. So when you get to the junior high and high school, it's not that critical. And besides, when the students self-select their classes, some classes are bigger than others. So now this is a guideline that is looked at every single year. And just like everything else, we review where we are and looking at that. But because this has come up, we had decided to take a discussion, have a discussion at the board table. So one of the things, we did get a couple of emails from people, and I did right. And the one thing that I really wanted to tell the parents, as I told these couple parents who wrote, is that it was unfortunate that perhaps some people that the guidelines were not shared with elementary parents. That's a very unfortunate piece. I don't know how that happened. So we do want to take a few minutes and discuss it tonight, and if we want to have any further conversations, we are. So that's where we are now. And many people know that we did have a meeting last May. It was open to anyone who wanted to come. A good number of the board members were there, I think almost everybody. So that's where we are now. So I think I'm going to throw it to Kevin, unless anyone wants to jump in right now. Joel, Gary, you guys were around. Do you have anything else to add to that?
I would like Kevin to go ahead and give us his information, his thoughts on this, and
Okay.
Sure.
I mean, I'm sorry, did I
No, you-
talk about the history?
No.
Okay, so thank you for putting this together for
Sure.
us, and
Sure. So as I shared with the board, there are several different, it's not an exhaustive list, but several different studies that were done on the effective class size and student learning. And as you read the different studies, there isn't a definitive, yes, this is the perfect class size for students. There's a lot of different factors that go into it, and then even students who come from a low-income family would benefit greater than a student who doesn't. So there's all these different factors that go into it, and I've got a couple that I pulled up just real quick for the board, just to kind of what ends up happening. And we looked at this last spring, and it's included, but and the reason why educators, we always look to Hattie is he kind of did an exhaustive look at all these different studies on what actually impacts student learning, and definitely when you go through the list, class size is there, but there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So, if you have a small class size but an ineffective teacher, it's not going to make a difference. But if you have a very effective teacher, then obviously it makes a difference. So usually it's the teacher and the training that the teacher receives that's number one. And then the last couple of years, my screen frozen.
it's not an iPad.
Yeah, that could be it. There we go, thanks. But we're operating under the evidence-based funding model, which draws some of its research from, again, what impacts student learning. And here the recommended class size for grades K through 3 is 15. And again, that will have a greater impact on a low-income student than it would a non-low-income student. But there's also other factors that are taken into account if you have instructional coaches, all-day kindergarten, some of the other things that we've implemented as a district. And so ultimately how they arrive at the cost of educating the students based upon these factors, and that's how they came up with the 4-tier system and everything. So again, I try to give you an idea of all the different studies that are out there. And a lot of times the one study that people actually point to is from the 80s. It was in Tennessee, in which a large school system, and they did a study of the impact of class size on student learning. And over time, even that study, though, there are flaws because, again, the building principal is not the same in each building, and that can have influence what occurs. The teachers are not the same. In some cases, even though there was a cap on class size, occasionally there are parents who, if they put pressure on the building to include their child, then their child was allowed to attend. And so it wasn't, it's very difficult with class size to just say, this is the number one most important factor. But in making that decision, though, when we do, and this spring, again, we will be looking at our staffing and our numbers and so forth, but it's just not even the number of students that come into play, but also the students who are in the classroom and, the number of students with IEPs and the other number of students that need different interventions, because that comes into play as well. So if it's a smaller group of students, but they have higher needs, then sometimes it does warrant keeping it in small sections. If it's students, though, that maybe don't need as much support, then they're more successful in a larger setting.
Okay. So I guess we're going to open it up to discussion here at the board table if there's a lot of information there. So anybody want to?
I can start.
Okay.
One of the things, thank you, Kevin, for putting together all of that information. I had a couple weeks off of grad school, and thanks for the 40 pages of reading that we got. But it was really helpful because as board members, we're not educators, so it's helpful to get up to speed on things. So one of the things a few things jumped out at me in the reading. One was in the evidence-based funding model, just a really positive thing that jumped out at me that I think we need to acknowledge is how many of these strategies that we're doing, in fact, most of the strategies with the highest impact on student learning we've implemented over the last 10 years. So full day kindergarten has a huge effect size, instructional coaches, our ELL, our academically focused summer school. So those are great strategies that we've recommended. I just want to recognize our district for all of those great interventions. A second thing that jumped out at me was in the incredible shrinking class size article, which I believe it was Madison, Wisconsin. So I'm on the finance committee here. As everyone knows, I'm really concerned about our deficit as a district. And class size and our deficit are very much connected because staffing makes up 80% of our spending. So when we have a deficit like we do, if we shrink class sizes, my concern is that we start shrinking programming to be able to afford to hire staff to keep those class sizes if we were to go down to 15, for example, as the evidence-based funding recommends. And we want to balance, we need to balance what's best for our students with our finances, because having a healthy financial district is what's best for our students. It means the programming that we have can remain. And some of the programs that we've implemented, like full day kindergarten, increase our staffing. Mm-hmm. Our dual language increases our staffing. Having art education and music and physical education increase our staffing. Those are very important things as well. So trying to look at it as a whole. But what I did love about that particular article was that they kept their staffing the same, mm-hmm. and they utilized this, so they had the same amount of FTE in the building, but they used their staffing very differently. And so that jumped out at me, especially as a unit district where we have 2 elementary schools. One thing I noticed, if we look at our current class sizes, is that, so we have both Manning and Miller in that document there, is that Miller's class sizes are actually much larger. So for example, 3rd grade monolingual is 27 kids in a class, like the concern of class that we heard about last time, with 25 students in a class, and Manning's 2nd grade. Miller's 5th grade mono is also 25. So we have, Miller's monolingual is 25. So we've got the issues at both elementary schools. And so I think that article from Madison really got me thinking, how can we, with a deficit, really maximize our staffing between the 2 elementary schools so that we can, and we also have space issues, particularly at Miller. So how can we utilize our staffing, look as more of a unit district among both elementary schools where we have issues with, we've got little bigger class sizes, we've got some space issues at Miller as well. Miller, so if you look at the evidence-based funding model, the smaller class sizes are more important for low-income students. At Miller, we have 41% of our students are low-income students. At Manning, we have 26%. So at Miller, it's even more important to also think about class sizes as well. So how can we utilize staffing between both schools in a way, if we wanted to move towards smaller class sizes? Could we rearrange? I'd love to hear what our staff think and what our administrators think about that. So we can do, if we want to move forward in this way, we can do it in a way that allows our district to remain financially stable, which is so important as well. Not to sound like a Debbie Downer. So those are just my initial thoughts after looking at what you provided for us.
I'm going to chime in and just say, I'm sorry, my cold is rearing up, but I couldn't have articulated my own thoughts any better than Dana just articulated her thoughts. So I am not just going to say ditto, but that's essentially what I'm saying. I think the Madison article really spoke to me as well, and just in terms of how we can best use our current resources to meet the comprehensive needs of the students in our elementary schools as a unit district.
Before we go, just to piggyback on that, just one little thing. It was also interesting in the articles how they talked about whether a district is a unit district or not, because you inherently have some feedback from below and up. And so, one of the other factors is that the PLC, where our teachers do speak a lot, even though they're two separate elementary buildings. So that another key element in the student learning environment. So I like that avenue too. In some of the articles, how they talked about a unit district is different than a standalone elementary district, because then you have resources like
That you can
right,
share.
Our high school music teacher goes to the elementary school, so you would not have that in an elementary school. So that also factored into some of the studies. So anyway, I just wanted to piggyback on that. So someone else?
Yeah, I would, Marie. I just want to let the parents know that we do take you seriously, and we do hear you, and we really value what you have to say. So whenever you contact us, we have to find our information, we meet together, we discuss the issues, and our time frame in getting back isn't always quite as quick as you might like it. But I want you to know that we do value what you have to say. We do value your feedback, and we do hear you.
I guess I'll just add my 2 cents worth. In all this information here, I mean, I was looking at over the past several days. I mean, one thing that really spoke to me was the importance of everything. The importance of the parents being involved, the importance of the quality of the teacher, the importance of the quality of the classroom, the importance of the student being in school every day. Okay, that's really what kind of leapt out at me as you were looking at all this different information about what made this good or what made that good. It's really the whole, the collective. And I can say that from my experience here that, that's really what it is. Every class is different, every student is different, every year is different, every grade level is different every year. Because students improve, some improve at a higher rate than others, you have the achievement gaps. I mean, there's a whole conglomerate of information and things to look at, to be concerned about, to make sure the student gets educated. One of the main reasons why I'm on this board is because of this topic. As my fellow board members know, my children and several of the children here were the last of the bubble classes. So we were in classes of kindergarten and first grade of 28, 29, and 30. So yeah, I get your passion. I understand it, okay? And that's really what we're trying to do. Kevin comes along and creates the small giants theory for us, where we can't be a big school. We can't offer everything a big school can offer. So what we're going to offer, we're going to make sure we do it at the best level we can. And that's really where I think we're at. Would I like to see smaller class sizes? Absolutely. I would love to. Let's come up with a plan. Let's see if there's a way to do it. Let's get parents involved in the strategic planning that's been going on here. Let's talk about maybe a different direction or a new direction for the school. Happy to do whatever we can to improve the daily experience of the students. That's really where I'm coming from. As for these guidelines here, when these came out, as Marie had said a number of years ago, there was a tremendous imbalance in the district. So as our kids were struggling in 28 and 29, the students in the other first grade in the other building were in classrooms of 13 and 14 and 15. Guess what I thought? Okay? I was in those seats. Okay? So, yes, it is important. Judy, I'd like to thank you for pointing that out too. Your concerns are very important, and this is not going to be the end of this discussion. I would say please stay involved. Please, as we have strategic planning for the next directions of the district, get involved and help us, okay? Because there is tremendous information out there that says, you know, class size, you know, a smaller class size is better. And I can't argue with what I saw here. I mean, it showed it. It just doesn't show that it's leaps and bounds above everything else. So that's what I would add.
And I think so much, like Kevin had mentioned, and I know what we talked about when we first established the class guidelines, is the makeup of that individual class. And, you know, the students' individual needs in that classroom, how are they being met, what resources dedicated to those, maybe an individual student's need might actually be benefiting multiple students in that classroom. You know, when you have extra teaching assistants in the classroom that work in small groups, primarily for a student who has special needs, but they're working in small groups with other students, that's a plus. That's individual attention that they may not be getting. So there's so many factors that go into that classroom dynamic that it really is a case-by-case situation that has to be reviewed and looked at, and not necessarily by you or me here, although we'll ultimately make a decision whether we have the money for it or not. But you know, that information comes and is shared with the board about those needs, you know, if we have that situation come up. So if a class size of 25, but there's some unique needs, then maybe we do need to take a look at that. I'm happy having guidelines because we didn't have them for so long, and it does make it at least somewhere to start the discussion and to look at things and make sense out of equity throughout our elementary buildings in particular. I do think that there'll be opportunity in strategic planning that's going to be coming up to, you know, further these conversations as well and get further input from hopefully a larger segment of our student population and their parents, and maybe there's some other routes to go. I know we've talked about other avenues in the past, you know, community-based grade schools, grade level centers, and all of those things always crop up in strategic planning discussions, and you know, that's something that could be looked at and talked about as well.
So I just want to say that, you know, I feel very, very, very strongly, and I hope if, for myself, my own self, that I hope people know, specifically people here or people watching, that we are here as board members, but we're also parents, and we feel exactly what we have felt where you are and still do. And there's a personal element to it. Like, yeah, like one thing Gary said is we saw this huge injustice. And one thing I've heard lately is, you know, does the board care about small class sizes? And that particular piece, not from here, but is particularly, I take that a little bit harder, because all of the pieces that we have spent so much time on is what is the best for the student's environment. just listening to the list that Gary talked about, you know, you have X amount of dollars, and what's the best way to use that for the students? So another thing that we did recently was and when I mean recently, since this guideline came out, we spent the money and not only fixed the buildings, but air conditioned the buildings. That was a huge piece of the environment for the buildings. There was a teacher who used to keep a thermometer, and they always would talk about how hot that room got. We have recently renovated the buildings to make them safer. That has to play into the student and the learning environment to feel safer to the building. I particularly asked Kevin to put this up. I think this study is phenomenal, and it also brings to light how many of the things that we do. So particularly when it comes to the topic of class size, you know, my children were in classes that were 32, and it was a long road to get to where we are now, that we have some element. And we have been so fortunate in our district. I will thank all the administrators and people at Kim watching the money, that we have been able to do all these things and not go back to a horrible place that we were a long time ago, where we had to cut things. And I never, ever, 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 ever want to be in that position again. Mm-hmm. And instead, what we have been doing is taking a look at what do we need, keeping in mind the small giants mentality. What can we do that we can do so much better than anybody else? So again, the class size piece is so important. It is so important. And it is part of the bigger picture of all of these pieces. So I personally hope that the community knows that. And again, looking at these numbers, these are not just numbers on a piece of paper, these are students. And I can very much appreciate that when it comes to the board every spring, that the administrators who are educators come and suggest what is the best way to deal with those students. And with all the other people in the building, and, you know, volunteers are second to none, so. Does anybody else have anything to add?
The only thing is, that I had a thought on, and Kevin and I had talked to you sent you an email about this, is I'd love to get some of the other area schools' class sizes, partly because when we're talking about, when the evidence-based funding and several of these studies looked at classes as small as 15, and I'm not seeing that around us. And I know that it's K through third, not necessarily K through fifth. But when I'm looking at Lyle, Downers Grove, Clarendon Hills, I'm just looking at the Illinois State Report Card. I don't know how accurate that information is. The average class size is around 21 in those schools. So I'm curious of what other districts are doing, how they're able to staff in a way that makes sense. A parent had brought that up at public comment last time, is what are the other area schools around us doing? And I'd also be curious to see that. I don't know if the next meeting we could have that.
Yeah, we should, with, I think I explained it, Dan,
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the winter break. A lot of, our administrators are working, a lot of districts are not, so I wasn't getting the response to that. The only district that got back to me was Marker, and K through 3, their guideline is, again, it's a guideline, it's not board policy, or it's not in the negotiated agreement. K through 3 is 20, and then 4 through 8 is 25. But we are gathering that information. We'll have that information for the board at our next meeting.
Okay, Kevin, I would like to add to that. Could we also, because one of the things we're talking about that our district does is all these other elements, can we look at whether these what other schools? Do they have these same things, full-day kindergarten? Because I know Holmes just started full-day kindergarten just this last year, and we're in, year 6? So that, I think, that those are also factors that go into it. But I like that idea a lot, if we can look at that. I know in Naperville, I know a woman who's a elementary school teacher. She got 32 kids in her class. That's Naperville. So,
I guess I'll just throw this little piece of information back out there, and this really comes from Kevin and Jack Balderman. Of course, the most recent class sizes, which were the bubble class sizes from years ago, the most recent graduated class was the highest achieving class in the history of 201. So it can be done, okay? I mean, a class size is a huge thing, but just because you're in a larger class size does not mean you can't achieve. So they're the highest achieving class in the history, and I think this year's class is trying to beat them. So I guess we'll wait and see how that goes, but I just wanted to make that point.
yeah.
I wanted to say one more thing. The strategic plan was brought up here, and I'm not sure that the community is aware of where we're at with the strategic plan, so I'll take a stab at clarifying that, and then anybody else jump in. There was a joint committee last year that worked on strategic planning for the district. Those recommendations are now in workshop with the board and the administrative team, and once we get through that process, the community will be invited back again to participate in that process. So we don't necessarily have a timeline for that right now, but really through that strategic planning process is how we will get really underneath a lot of these issues and try to, come to resolution. So, is that?
And when we're at the point of, then that will be information shared with the community to be involved in. Okay, so that would be good. I like that idea of looking at what other districts are doing with the same comparable things to the extent we can.
And just to clarify, I'm not saying that just because another districts around us have larger class sizes, that means we shouldn't have smaller class sizes.
Right.
I think it's just a good way of educating ourselves, that's all.
Right. And I also think in terms of space, because I know that there's articles that talk about, or in California they did, well, they passed a very hard and fast, strict rule about class sizes. So then they had to bring in trailers because now the class sizes was here, so they didn't have space, and now they have trailers all over their schools. So that's another piece that comes into it.
It's the realities.
It's the reality of when, it's like a balloon, if you squeeze it here, so we were able to, with our 2 buildings, by moving people around and repositioning the classrooms, we were able to then take our bigger classes and make them smaller, but
I'm hoping, because that was a while ago that we looked at our space, I'm hoping we can look at space again.
Yep.
Especially when we're this class size being part of many other issues, I think, with those elementary buildings.
Right. Okay, so I personally think community members, it takes a lot of time to come to a board meeting, so first of all, thank you, and for taking the time to write us, so appreciate that. Okay, the next item on the discussion, we did have the policy first reading, but that is being removed because the policy committee needs to meet, and then we will have that hopefully maybe at the next meeting. Okay, presentation of monthly financial statements.
All right, for the month of November, we received $180,000 from the state. There are no fiscal year 19 payments vouchered, but $232,000 of fiscal year 20 vouchered. We received another installment of the 2018 tax levy in the amount of $420,000. So total property taxes collected are almost $0.9 million, which represents a 98.92% collection rate. And the collection rate for the prior 2 years was 98.99 and 98.65. We've probably collected just about everything. There might be a little bit of more money coming, but not too much. In the ed and tort funds, revenues are slightly higher than the prior year averages. We received $25,000 of fiscal year 19 payments and $155,000 of fiscal year 20 payments. And there's $77,000 of fiscal year 20 payments vouchered but not released. In the transportation fund, we did not receive any payments from the state this month. There's $155,000 of fiscal year 20 payments vouchered, so that represents the first quarter of our transportation payments. And then as far as expenditures go, in the ed and tort funds, they're comparable to the prior year average. In the O&M fund, we were 36.33% spent to date, and last year 36.89. So very comparable spending pattern this year. And then again, in the transportation fund, that varies based on our receipt of invoices. In terms of investments, we have $20.5 million invested. And again, since we're just about to the end of our tax receipt cycle, our fund balances start to go down, our investments start to go down as we use that money to pay our bills until taxes come again in May. So the basic revenues that we receive pretty much for the rest of the year are some student payments, are monies from the state, and that's about it. So does anybody have questions on any of the other reports?
No.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the next item then is the budget staffing timeline.
Every year I put together a calendar for the board that lays out the process we'll be working through for our budget and staffing. Even though we're only halfway through the year, we're already planning for the 2021 school year. And so Kim, since we've had the audit, Kim is in the process now of doing the 5-year forecast, and she'll be presenting that at an upcoming board meeting. And that kind of gives an idea of where we're at with our revenue and expenditures, and that kind of sets the tone for our planning. And then throughout this process, as you look through it, there are times when we're meeting with the principals to get their input. There will be also opportunities for the board to provide some input. I believe the February board meeting.
February 25th, yeah.
February 25th.
Yeah, February 25th will be an opportunity for the board to kind of give some thoughts to the admin team about some things they'd like to see incorporated into the budget and the budget process. And then we're also having staffing discussions. Staffing decisions will be made. The board will act on the recommendations at the March 17th board meeting. And then the remainder of the calendar then is refining the budget so that we have a tentative budget in place for the start of the fiscal year in July. And then the board typically will approve the actual budget in September.
Kevin, can you talk to us a little bit about how this timeline dovetails with the strategic planning process? And I mean, just from a planning standpoint, the strategic plan obviously sets the stage for some of the budgeting,
Right.
and how does that work?
We'll be a little bit out of sync because we want to have the plan in place by June.
Yeah.
And so the tentative timeline that I put together, we'll be gathering input. Like as you mentioned, we're going to have another board admin workshop.
Right.
And then we're going to be getting our stakeholders involved and get feedback from them. And so we'll already have our drafts in place, I think, in time.
Okay.
And then, they may get tweaked a little bit, but we should be on pretty good footing before we get to any final decisions.
Yeah, so that budget priorities can be
Right.
laid
Aligned.
out according, okay.
Right.
Thank you.
I had one question about the third bullet there. It says, present major projects to be considered for each building and the party responsible as the principal. So I was curious if we could, the last meeting we had talked with the chiller.
Right.
And the, making sure that we're making a priority list of not just the projects for the buildings, but also some of our infrastructure that we have. So I was curious if when the, our grounds supervisor.
I
would
just
be-
sent an email to Kim
And
after.
Joe's working on that. He's been
Yeah.
meeting with Steve
Awesome.
Cashman to go over, in fact, it was last week, to go over, all the buildings, and really they're working on what are those priority items.
So is that part of that third, or, is that separate from that third bullet
That's
point, I
not-
guess?
That would be separate. We
Okay.
have our capital development plan. It's a 5-year plan. And what gets incorporated into that then is the life safety study that was just completed. And the board finance committee and Kim, they meet and kind of look at those projects and prioritize and brings that information. This is more, give you an example. Last year, for instance, John for the junior high wanted signage in the junior high. So that's a project that, typically that wouldn't fall into the capital development, wouldn't fall into life safety, but it's a project that he would like to see happen within his building. And so it's more those types of projects that the principal will bring. But then Kim and Joe, they're in the facility committee, they're also working on those other elements.
Okay. I do want to encourage I know one thing that we voted down last meeting was the furniture. And I'd love for that to be incorporated, if that's still a priority, for that to be incorporated in that process in 3. I think having a larger scope of what else each building is considering might be a helpful.
Well, Dana, there's the Buildings and Grounds Committee, and that furniture has been on that plan for 3 or 4 years now. So, because that's part of what Marie's on it, I'm on it, John's on it, and we see a list of all these projects. Some are wish list items, like Kevin's saying.
Yeah.
Others are items that have been on the list for a long time. The chiller's been on the list for a number of years, just to give you an example.
Sure.
Okay? And every year you say, okay, we have this much money, what do we put on a priority? Then the finance committee discusses it, and then we discuss it. So, there is, the steps are in place that way.
So
Okay?
how does that committee, I don't see that committee on this budget timeline, or how does
Well,
that
this is
committee
just the budget.
interact?
Well, that's
I see
gonna be
the
more
finance committee,
that's
but I
gonna be
don't
more the
see-
finance committee, yeah.
Well, the finance committee comes in if you want to add, I would think a whole new curriculum or something, right?
Well, yeah, Dana, when we go through those projects, we also meet with the finance committee on that. And
Gotcha.
kind of look and do the
Right.
priorities, and then have a conversation with the finance committee as well.
But I did want to, once I was, once the holidays were behind us, I sent an email to Kim thinking about the last board meeting and asking if we could find a date to have the facilities committee meet again
Okay,
to do that. And then once we do that, then we'll bring that back to
the board,
to the board, yeah,
awesome. Yeah, that would be really helpful,
yeah.
because I don't know if we've gotten a report in a while for that, so that
Yeah,
would be really
well,
helpful.
the last time we met was with Steve Cashman about the life safety, and then, about that, so. Okay, is that everything? It just dawned on me when you're talking about this, and I wish some of the parents were still here. There have been in the past, every year, we go through this whole process, and we do the budget staffing, and we look and everything, and then after registration, all of a sudden, there's a huge influx of a certain grade. So there was a year, I don't remember when it was, that we said, there's so many kids, we need to add another class.
Yeah, we did.
So it's not like it's in stone in the spring, because we don't know what that's gonna, what the registration will bring to us. So, that is something that we constantly look at, so before the start of the school year, so. But it reminded me of that just when we were looking at this timeline.
One of the things I was thinking, I don't know if this is helpful or not to consider, was there was a few districts I've seen do registration really early. So their existing families, they do registration in the spring. Before the end of the school year, you get a $30 discount or something on your registration fees to try to capture as much, and 100% of the registration is done online for those existing families, just to try to capture as many student enrollment. So, because we're talking about the first tentative budget is sometime in June, having that is 80% of the enrollment done before. You can still certainly have a huge kindergarten class size that you
Right.
can't capture. But just something to consider. I don't know if that's a direction we want to go in or not.
But like I said, there was a year that we had, and we, like said, that we, even though we made the plans in the spring, we've got to change it because this is what the numbers show, and we need to deal with those children, so. Yeah, okay. Anything else?
No.
On the timeline? Okay, thank you. Let's see, action item. Hold on, where did I have too much paper? Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. Maybe I'm not out of, okay, action item, the approval of the 2020 through 2021 school calendar. Do you want to talk about that a little
Sure.
bit?
At our last meeting, two calendars were presented to the board, and there really were not, the only difference was calendar B had one more day to the holiday break, so instead of coming back on a Monday, students would come back on Tuesday. The calendar committee's recommendation was calendar A, which is pretty traditional what we've had in the past, and so that was the recommendation, is that the board approve calendar A.
Okay, so, anybody have any questions? The chair will entertain a motion to approve option A of the 2020-2021 school year calendar as presented.
So moved.
Second?
Roll call, please.
Ms. Wilson,
Yes.
Mr. Armstrong,
Yes.
Mrs. Coyle,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yes.
Mrs. Stromeyer,
Yes.
Mrs. Charlton.
Yes.
Thank you.
And now that we've done that, could I please, I always ask,
Sure.
will you post this online so that the
Yep.
parents can see?
We'll
So,
post it tomorrow.
so the first day of student attendance is August 19th. Okay, perfect. Thank you, thank you. Okay, superintendent's report.
A couple items in my report. One is, I always like to do this time of year. Fortunately, the winter's been mild. We haven't had the need for emergency days. But just to remind our school community that, that decision is never an easy decision. And I know when it's made that some parents agree with it and some parents are very unhappy if school is called off. And even if a school is in session, if parents feel that it's best to keep their children home, they always have that option. But, our process that we use, when we start getting those weather reports, typically myself and our Director of Building and Grounds, we monitor those weather conditions, and then very early in the morning, we start having conversations to determine whether or not we can keep our parking lots open, our sidewalks, if the buildings will be accessible, and we consult with our bus company. And then no school district likes to be out on an island, so usually I'm on a conference call with several other superintendents, and we all talk about what we're hearing about our area and how our facilities look, and we all kind of share our thoughts as to whether or not we think school can go. If we can make that decision the night before, sometimes, it's pretty obvious, we will. But in any case, usually by 5:15 in the morning, that decision is made, and then we communicate it through social media. It gets posted on the Emergency Closing Center, and and then when it comes to extreme cold, if it's a wind chill advisory, that doesn't get our attention. When it's a wind chill warning, that's what gets our attention. That's when we start to monitor that. And again, similar process. We're monitoring what the actual weather is, and we're having conversations with other districts and making that decision. If school is canceled, as far as after-school activities, usually later that day a decision is made about school activities. And by 1 o'clock, if we think we need to cancel any competitions in the afternoon or practices, that decision is made. And again, that's shared through our website and social media. And so hopefully we won't need to work through that process.
Kevin, can I jump in here for a minute? I know every year this is always a conversation, but it's also extremely important to talk about the staff. Because
Right.
whereas all the families live right here, the staff has to come from further away, and
Right.
that's always a factor
Right.
too, so.
And I guess just to make the point again, the superintendents make that
The
decision.
superintendent makes
not-
that.
Not the other people sitting at this
Yes,
table.
it is not the board.
Superintendents.
Yes.
That
It's a
is
superintendent's decision. It's not a board decision.
ISB
it's
101 board policy. However, I will share with you that I know some seniors who would really love a couple days off because
Yeah, they typically don't make those up. so.
they don't. So I'm just passing that along, so.
And then one piece of good news, our high school applied for the Rick DeFort PLC Award. You have to be a highly performing high school in order to apply, and we were named one of 3 finalists for that award. And we will find out at the end of January whether or not we are the recipient of that award.
And this is the video that Jack shared here at the.
I think in
at the-
September
Okay.
at the board meeting.
Yay.
That's
And
really awesome.
That's wonderful.
So-
And when is the PLC summit?
January 30th,
The end of the month?
end of the month.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have some news to share, so. Way to go. So that's the whole country,
Yes.
the whole country, so, great. Okay. Are
That's it.
you done?
I'm
now?
done.
Okay, great. Are there any board reports?
I have one, Marie. I wanted to let you know that I went to the winter assembly at the junior high right before school was out, and both bands played, both choral groups sang, and at the end, the teachers all got together and sang a song for the students, which everybody thought was great. But commenting on the choral and the band program, the high school's really inheriting some really good singers and good players, and we can just look forward to that after they cross the street next year.
Okay. I had one thing to add. The junior high, so that's the Snowflake program, they have extended their deadline for students to turn in their packets. So that extension is now January 10th. So if there are junior high students that want to participate in Snowflake, they have extended it through this first week after the first of the year. So, and just as a plug, the snow program in our district is spectacular. So if there are any junior high students out there, take advantage of that, so. Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, this is an upcoming event. The Bilingual Parents Advisory Committee is going to be having a meeting, but also a social night on Thursday, January 16th. It'll be held at Miller. They're going to have a light dinner and then candy bar bingo, so it is a family-friendly event. That committee, the Bilingual Parents Advisory Committee, is a district-wide committee, and not only for parents of bilingual students, but for all parents who are interested in the direction of that program. So I just would encourage people to come out, whether or not you are interested in that specific committee. Come out, have some fun, have a hot dog, and play candy bar bingo on the 16th at 5:30 at Miller.
Okay, anything else? All right, then, future meeting and events, so there's no school on January 20th. Okay, January 20th, 2020. Okay, Martin Luther King Day. And then the next school board meeting is also the Student Achievement Board meeting. So that's January 21st, and that will be at Westmont High School. Now, one decision we did make, that meeting will start at 6:30 at the high school. We've changed our meetings times to start at 6 for closed and the open starting at 7, but we're sticking with the 6:30 time, start time. So that's January 21st, 6:30 at Westmont High School. The chair will entertain a motion to enter closed session to discuss personnel issues. I'm sorry, are there any other public comments? Sorry. The chair will entertain a motion to enter closed session to discuss personnel issues, collective bargaining, student discipline, and the superintendent's evaluation.
So moved.
Second?
Roll call, please.
Mr. Armstrong,
Yes.
Mrs. Coyle,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yeah.
Mrs. Stromeyer,
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Yes.
Mrs. Charlton?
Yes,
Thank you.
and there will not be a vote after closed.